The morning Ray Calloway drove his 1987 John Deere 4240 into the parking lot of Saunders Agricultural Equipment. The Texas sun was already punishing. It was the kind of August heat that made the asphalt shimmer and turned the air above the highway into something liquid and uncertain. Ray had been up since 4:30, the way he always was, the way his father had been before him, and his grandfather before that. The Calloway men didn't sleep past sunrise. The land didn't allow for it. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tractor tick as it cooled. The machine was 37 years old. The green paint had long since faded to something closer to gray-green, a tired color. The color of things that had worked very hard for a very long time. The seat had been restitched twice with leather from an old saddle. The steering wheel had a crack down the left side that Ray had wrapped with electrical tape in 1999 and never bothered to replace. But the engine was sound. He knew it the way a man knows the sound of his own heartbeat. Ray climbed down from the cab. He was 53 years old, built like a fence post, lean and straight and weathered. His hands were the kind of hands that told a story without needing words. Thick-knuckled, stained with grease that no amount of soap would fully remove, the left index finger missing its tip from a bailing accident in 1991. He wore a Wrangler shirt, the color of faded denim, jeans with a working crease at the knee, and boots that had seen 10 Texas summers without a polish. On his head sat a John Deere cap that had belonged to his father, the logo almost entirely gone. He stood beside the tractor and looked at the dealership. It was a large, clean building, the kind that had gone up in the last 15 years. All glass and metal and corporate signage. American flags flanked the entrance. Inside, through the wide glass windows, he could see rows of gleaming new equipment. Combines, sprayers, tractors with GPS guidance systems and air-conditioned cabs that looked more like airplane cockpits than farm machinery. The smell of new rubber and fresh paint drifted out when the automatic doors opened. Ray took off his cap, ran a hand through his gray-streaked hair, and put it back on. He needed a trade-in evaluation. The bank had been patient with him, more patient than he deserved. He sometimes thought, but the note on the property was coming due in the spring, and the last 2 cotton seasons had been poor. Not catastrophic, not the kind of poor that broke a man in a single year, but the slow, grinding kind that wore a farm down the way, wind wears down stone. He needed a newer machine with lower operating costs. He needed the dealership to give him something, anything, for the 4-40 that he could put toward the difference. He went inside. The showroom was cool and bright. A young woman at the front desk smiled at him with the automatic warmth of someone trained to smile. She wore a headset and a blue polo shirt with the dealership logo. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" "I'm looking to talk to someone about a trade-in evaluation," Ray said. "Got a 87 John Deere outside. Looking to put it towards something newer." "Of course. Let me get one of our equipment specialists for you." She pressed something on her headset. "Mr. Saunders, I have a gentleman at the front desk asking about a trade-in evaluation." "Yes, sir. Thank you." She looked back at Ray with the same precise smile. "Derek Saunders will be right with you. Can I get you some water? Coffee?" "I'm fine. Thank you." Ray waited near the entrance, turning his cap in his hands. 2 other men were in the showroom, both younger than him, both wearing the clean clothes of men whose farming was more business than labor. They were looking at a new 8R series tractor, nodding as a salesman walked them through the technology package. Ray looked at the price tag on the nearest one. He felt the number land somewhere in his chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Ray Calloway. The man who came toward him was somewhere in his early 40s, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of tan that came from outdoor events rather than outdoor work. He wore a pressed blue shirt, khaki slacks, and leather shoes that had no business being near actual soil. His hair was dark, neatly combed, and he had a smile that reached exactly as far as it needed to, and no further. He extended his hand. "Derek Saunders. I run the equipment sales division here. You're looking to trade in?" "That's right." Ray shook his hand. I've got an 87 John Deere 4240 outside. She's got about 11,000 hours on her, but the engine was rebuilt in 2008 and the hydraulics were serviced last year. Runs clean. Derek nodded with the expression of a man already making calculations. Let's take a look. They walked outside together into the hammer of the heat. Ray led him around to where the 4240 sat in the parking lot, patient and still. Its faded green body contrasting sharply with the clean new machines visible through the dealership windows. Derek Saunders stopped walking when he saw it. There was a pause. Just a second, maybe less, and then he laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh. It wasn't the awkward laugh of a man trying to soften a difficult assessment. It was a full, genuine laugh, the kind that came from the belly, and it was aimed directly at the tractor. He shook his head slowly, still smiling, and walked a half circle around the machine, the way a man walks around a car accident, curious but detached. Mr. Calloway. He crouched briefly to look at the front axle, then stood. I appreciate you bringing this in. I really do. But I have to be honest with you. He gestured broadly at the machine. This is what I'm looking at here is scrap metal. I mean, we're talking about a machine that's almost 40 years old. The paint is gone. The cabbie's cracked. He tapped the door frame. The tires on the front are probably original. They're not original, Ray said. His voice was quiet and flat. And I've got customers waiting for modern equipment with parts availability and financing support. I can't move something like this on a trade. He looked at Ray directly. Best I could do, and I'm being generous here, is maybe $300. As scrap value, Ray said nothing for a moment. He could feel the heat on the back of his neck. He could feel the two men from inside the showroom watching through the glass. He was aware of his own hands on the brim of his cap, and he made himself stop turning it. $300, he repeated, generous, given the condition. Derek's tone had the practiced patience of a man accustomed to delivering news that other people didn't want to hear. If you want, I can put you in contact with a salvage yard over in Abilene. That might even do a pickup, save you the trouble of hauling it. Ray looked at the tractor. He looked at it for a long moment. This machine, he said slowly, planted 14,000 acres of cotton. It pulled my father's combine out of a ditch in a February freeze. It ran for 60 hours straight during the harvest of 2003 when every other machine in the county was down. He paused. My father bought it, new, paid for it himself. Cash. Derek Saunders said nothing. His expression was polite and unmoved. The expression of a man waiting for an old story to finish. $300, Ray said again. Then he put his cap back on, climbed up into the cab, turned the key, and listened to the engine start with a deep, solid, unhesitating rumble. He backed the tractor out of the parking lot without another word, merged onto Farm Road 707, and drove home. He did not look in the mirror. The Calloway farm sat on 412 acres of West Texas flatland, 12 miles outside the town of Merkel. The land was not beautiful in any way that a person from a city would recognize. There were no hills, no dramatic vistas, no picturesque red barns. There was just the flat reach of the Edwards Plateau, pale brown soil, cotton rows stretching to a horizon that seemed too far away, and a sky so large and so blue that it sometimes felt less like weather and more like a permanent condition. The house was white, wood-framed, built in 1947 by Ray's grandfather, Samuel Calloway, who had come to Taylor County from Georgia after the war with a wife, a pickup truck, $120, and the kind of stubbornness that the Texas landscape seemed to reward in certain men. The porch sagged slightly on the east side. The kitchen window had a crack in the lower right corner that Ray had been meaning to repair for 3 years. The barn behind the house was newer, built in 1978, the year Ray was born, a fact his father had always found significant. Ray pulled the 4240 into the barn and shut off the engine. He sat in the cab for a moment in the cool dimness, listening to the machine settle. Then he climbed down and stood looking at it with his hands in his back pockets. His wife, Carol Calloway, came to the barn door. She was 51, A rangy woman with dark hair going silver at the temples and the kind of face that was more handsome than pretty, strong-featured, honest, capable of great warmth and considerable severity in almost equal measure. She held a dish towel in one hand and looked at him with the expression she had for bad news. "How'd it go?" $300, Ray said. Carol was quiet for a moment. Cash value? Scrap value. He looked at her. He laughed at her. Carol walked out, looked at the machine, and laughed. Carol pressed her lips together. She looked at the tractor, then back at her husband. "Ray, I know. What are we going to do about the spring note?" "I know." "Ray, I'm not asking to hear. I know. I'm asking what we're going to do." He ran a hand over his jaw. "I'll call Denny Marsh. See if he needs seasonal help with the Hendricks contract, and I'll figure out the equipment situation another way." He looked at the tractor again. "I'm not selling her for $300. I'm not." Carol looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that contained 15 years of marriage and all its negotiations. Then she nodded once and went back to the house. Ray stayed in the barn. He pulled a shop stool up beside the tractor and sat down and rested his elbows on his knees and thought about his father. Robert Calloway had been a man of few words and considerable pride. He had bought the 4240 in 1987 when Ray was 9 years old, and the machine's arrival on the farm had been an event. The neighbors had come to look at it. His mother had made lemonade, and his father had walked around the tractor 3 times before he would let anyone else touch it. It was the first new piece of major equipment the Calloways had ever owned. Everything before it had been used, borrowed, or rebuilt from parts. His father had died in 2011, a Tuesday morning in March, in the cab of a different tractor, a massive coronary that the doctor said had been coming for years. Ray had been in the North Field when it happened. By the time he found him, it was already over. He had never fully resolved that morning. He suspected he never would. He looked at the 4240 in the half-light of the barn and made a decision that was less a decision than a refusal. He would not sell her, not to a salvage yard. Not to a man who laughed. He would fix what needed fixing, and he would use her until she could not be used. And then he would figure out what came next. He stood up, found his tools, and got to work. 20 years is a long time in a man's life and a short time on a piece of land. By 2024, the Calloway farm had survived 3 droughts, 1 catastrophic hailstorm that had taken out an entire cotton crop and most of the barn roof, 2 extended periods when the commodity price had made farming feel less like a livelihood and more like an argument with mathematics, and 1 year minus 2019 when Ray had genuinely considered selling and moving to Lubbock to work for his brother-in-law's HVAC company. He had not sold. He had not moved to Lubbock. He had the stage. The 4240 was still in the barn. Ray Calloway was 73 years old now, and the years had done to him what years do to men who work outside. They had carved him. His face had the texture of old wood, deeply lined, sun-darkened, with pale brackets around his eyes from squinting and a permanent slight squint that remained even indoors. He had lost some height, not much, but enough to notice. His hands were the same hands, more or less, just more deliberate in their movements, less quick to grab. The missing fingertip on his left hand had long since become simply part of the landscape of himself. Carol had died in 2020. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in October, gone by the following March. The speed of it had been the worst part, not the suffering, though there had been that. But the way a person who had been absolutely central to the structure of daily life could simply cease to be there, leaving behind a silence that was its own kind of weather. Ray had not he did not think he would. His son, Daniel Calloway, was 44 and lived in Merkel with his wife, Patricia, and their son, Owen, who was 16 and had his great-grandfather's dark eyes and his grandmother, Carol's directness, and a way of sitting quietly in the corner of a room and taking everything in that Ray found both familiar and mysterious. Daniel worked for the county water district, a stable government job that Ray had mixed feelings about. He was proud of his son's steadiness, the way he had built a solid, sensible life, and he was aware in a way he never said aloud. That some part of him had wanted Daniel to want the farm the way he had wanted it. Daniel was a good son. He came out every Saturday. He helped with whatever needed helping. But the land did not call to him the way it had called to Ray. And Ray had made his peace with that. Mostly, Owen was different. Owen came to the farm the way Ray had come to it, as a boy, not because he was sent, but because he wanted to be there. He was interested in the machinery, in the soil chemistry, in the way water moved across flat ground. He asked questions that indicated he had been thinking about the subject before he arrived, which Ray considered the mark of genuine curiosity, as opposed to polite conversation. He was, in Ray's private assessment, the best person in the family. And Ray was aware that this was an unfair thing to think about a 16-year-old boy, but he thought it anyway. It was a Saturday morning in late September when Owen arrived at the farm and found his grandfather in the barn. Ray was standing in front of the Ford 4.0. The tractor had not moved in 4 years. The last time Ray had used it in the field had been in the fall of 2020, 3 weeks after Carol died, a long day of disking the North 40 that he now understood had been less about the field and more about needing to be in motion. After that, something in him had simply stopped using it. He had maintained it, kept the battery charged, turned it over periodically, checked the fluids, but he had not worked with it. It sat in the far corner of the barn, patient and still, under a canvas tarp that had acquired its own layer of dust. Now Ray had pulled the tarp off. "What are you doing?" Owen asked, dropping his backpack by the barn door. "Thinking," Ray said. Owen came and stood beside him. He was tall for 16, lean the way the Callaway men tended to be lean, with Carol's dark hair and his father's jaw. He looked at the tractor with the focused attention he gave to things that interested him. "She's still run. Last I turned her over. Yes." "What are you thinking about her?" Ray was quiet for a moment. "I called Mike Ferris over at the equipment yard in Sweetwater last week. Asked him what he'd give me for scrap." He paused. "He said $600. Owen looked at him. "You're not going to sell her for $600? "No," Ray said. "I'm not." He looked at the tractor. "But I'm 73 years old, Owen, and my back gives me trouble every morning before 10 and better trouble every evening after 6. And I've got 40 acres. I'm not planting because I can't do the prep work anymore. So I need to make a decision." "What kind of decision about what to do with her? Whether to sell the parts, which is where the money is, or whether to stop there. I don't know. I thought I'd take a look at the motor. Properly. One last time." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I help?" Ray looked at him. "You know anything about a diesel engine?" "I know what you've taught me." That was true. Over the years, through dozens of Saturday afternoons in this barn, Ray had taught Owen the fundamentals. Not as formal lessons, but as the natural conversation of two people working alongside each other. Owen could change oil, adjust valve clearances, troubleshoot a fuel system, and read a manifold pressure gauge. He was not an expert, but he was not nothing. "All right," Ray said. "Let's pull the valve cover first." They worked through the morning, methodically. Ray talked as he worked. Not instruction. Exactly. More like narration. The way an old man talks when he's doing something he's done many times and the doing of it brings back other times. He talked about the engine rebuild in 2008, when he and Danny Ortega, a mechanic from Merkel, who had since retired to Arizona, had spent 3 weekends pulling the motor completely apart and rebuilding it bearing by bearing. He talked about the harvest of 2003, the 60-hour run, the way the engine had sounded at the end of it, tired but true. The way a horse sounds after a long day, that it has given everything to. Owen listened and worked and asked questions at the right moments. By 11 o'clock, they had the valve cover off and were examining the head. The engine was old but not broken. Ray ran his fingers along the valve seats with a deliberate attention of long familiarity. "She's sound," he said. "Earnestly, for a 37-year-old engine. She's remarkable." "Why do you think that is?" Owen asked. "Because my father took care of her," Ray said simply. "And then I did." Owen was leaning over the engine block, looking at something. He reached in carefully. "Grandpa! M.M. There's something in here." Ray looked up. "What do you mean, something?" "I mean, there's something wrapped up down here in the cavity behind the secondary bracket." Owen's voice had changed slightly, the tone of someone who has found something unexpected and is not yet sure what to make of it. "It feels like, I don't know, it's wrapped in something oily. Like cloth or something." Ray came around to Owen's side of the engine. He put on his reading glasses, found his flashlight, and leaned in. Owen was right. Wedged into a cavity in the engine block, not a manufacturing space, but a gap created by the placement of the bracket assembly, a space large enough for a man's fist, was something wrapped in what appeared to be old mechanic's cloth, the heavy, dark gray cotton that was common in toolkits in the 1980s. It had been packed in carefully, and it sat there, undisturbed, for God knew how long. Ray stared at it. "How long has that been there?" Owen said. Ray said nothing for a moment. He was doing arithmetic in his head, not the arithmetic of numbers, but the arithmetic of time. The engine rebuild had been in 2008. If the package had been in the block before the rebuild, Danny Ortega would have found it, unless he had put it back. Unless he had been told to put it back. "Unless my father," Ray said quietly. Owen looked at him. "What? The engine was original before 2008. Your great-grandfather bought this tractor in 1987, and nobody opened the block until Danny and I did it in 2008. He paused. "And Danny was my father's friend before he was mine. They went to school together." He was still staring at the wrapped package. He never said anything about finding anything in the engine. "Maybe he put it back," Owen said. "Maybe," Ray said. He reached in carefully and worked the package free. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it to the workbench and set it down under the barn light and stood looking at it for a moment before he began to unwrap it. The cloth was stiff with old oil, fragile at the folds. It came apart in layers. Inside the outer cloth was a second wrapping of waxed paper, yellowed but intact, that had protected whatever was inside from the oil and the heat and the years. Ray peeled the waxed paper back slowly. Inside was a small tin box, the kind that had once held throat lozenges, a common brand from the 70s and 80s. The lid was sealed shut with a band of electrical tape that had lost most of its adhesion but had stayed on. Ray peeled the tape away and opened the box. Inside the box were three things: a folded letter, handwritten on the kind of lined paper that came from a school notebook, a small brass key with a number stamped on its head, 447, and a photograph. Ray picked up the photograph first. It was black and white, printed on the thick paper stock of the 1960s or early 70s, slightly faded but clear. It showed two men standing in front of what appeared to be the Callaway barn, the old barn, the one that had stood before the 1978 rebuild, the one Ray only knew from other photographs. The men were young, maybe 20. One of them was his father, Robert Callaway, unmistakably, with the same jaw and the same posture, and a young man's version of the face Ray had known. The other man Ray did not recognize. The stranger was taller than his father, with lighter hair and an easy smile. They both had their arms around each other's shoulders in the way of men who are close, not performing closeness, but expressing it naturally. His father was grinning. Ray had rarely seen photographs of his father grinning. He set the photograph down and picked up the letter. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. He read the letter, standing at the workbench, with Owen reading over his shoulder. The handwriting was his father's. He recognized it from farm ledgers and birthday cards and the single letter. Robert Callaway had written to Ray when Ray had gone to Abilene Christian University for 2 years before coming home. His father had been a man who wrote the way he spoke, directly, without decoration, each sentence doing exactly one thing. Ray, if you're reading this, then either you or someone you trust found what I put here. I put it here in 1987, the day after I bought the tractor. I'm going to write this the way I know how, which is plain, and I hope it's enough. The man in the photograph is Walter Greer. He was my closest friend from the age of 14 until I was 32 years old. If you don't know that name, it's because I never spoke it after 1972, which is something I am not proud of, and which this letter is meant to explain, at least in part. Walter and I grew up together. His family had the property east of ours, the parcel that is now the Hendricks land. His father was Leonard Greer, a good man who died young. After Leonard died, Walter and I worked both farms together through high school and into our early 20s. We were partners, the way you can only be partners when you're young enough to believe that arrangement is permanent. In 1968, I borrowed money from Walter. Not a small amount. At the time, it was $4,000, which was most of what he had. I borrowed it because we were in a bad year and I was going to lose the East 40 if I didn't make the bank payment. And your grandfather, my father, had been gone 2 years by then, and I was alone with the land and too proud to ask the bank for an extension. Walter gave me the money without a contract, without interest, without anything except his word and mine. I paid him back. I want you to know that first. It took me until 1971, but I paid him back every dollar. What I did not do was tell him the truth about why I needed it. I told him I needed it for equipment. That was partly true. What I did not tell him was that I had also that year made a bad investment, bought into a mineral lease north of Midland, advice of a man I should not have trusted, and that the $4,000 was also covering that loss. I was ashamed of the lease. Walter would have helped me either way, but I was ashamed. And so, and the lie was small enough that I thought it would not matter. It mattered. In 1972, Walter found out about the lease from someone in town. I don't remember who now. It was a long time ago. He came to see me. He was not angry the way I expected him to be. He was quiet. He said, "Robert, you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." That was all he said about it. Then he told me he was leaving Texas. He had a sister in Oregon. He was going to go there. I did not ask him to stay. I should have. I was too proud. I thought my pride was the same thing as dignity. It was not. Walter left in the summer of 1972. We did not speak again. I have thought about this for 15 years as of the day I'm writing this. The truth is, I think about it almost every day. Not in a dramatic way, not suffering. Exactly. More like a splinter you can't reach. Something you are always aware of. The key is to a safe deposit box at First National Bank in Merkel. Box 447. I opened the account in 1975. In the box, there is a letter I wrote to Walter that I never sent. And there is also a deed to the east, 12 acres of the property, what I always call the river parcel. Though the river is more a creek. I bought that parcel back from the Hendricks family in 1979. I always intended it to be Walter's, or his family's. If he had family, call it repayment for a debt that wasn't only money. I am telling you this in a letter hidden in a tractor engine because I am not brave enough to say it out loud while I am alive. I know that about myself. I hope you will be braver than I was. Your father, Robert Abon, was very quiet. A mockingbird was working through its repertoire somewhere outside, cycling through half a dozen borrowed songs with the cheerful relentlessness of its kind. A barn swallow cut through the open door, circled once, and disappeared into the rafters. The engine of the 4240 ticked gently in the heat, Owen said, softly. Grandpa. Ray did not say anything. He was looking at the letter. But he was not reading it anymore. He was thinking about his father's face, specifically the face Robert Calloway had worn when he thought no one was watching. A face that Ray had seen rarely and remembered clearly. The face of a man holding something he had decided long ago that he would never put down. He had not known what his father was carrying. He had never thought to ask. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and set it back in the tin box. He picked up the brass key and held it in his palm for a moment. A small, ordinary thing. The kind of key that opened nothing important and everything important at once. We need to find out if Walter Greer is still alive, he said. Owen straightened up. His voice was careful and even, "How do we do that?" "I don't know yet," Ray said. "But we start with a bank." He closed his hand around the key. First National Bank of Merkel had been on the corner of Oak Street and Ranch Road 1235 for 80 years, occupying the same two-story limestone building that Ray's father had walked into as a young man and that Ray had walked into for the first time at the age of 7, holding his father's hand to open a savings account with $11. The building had been renovated twice in that time. The interior updated in the 80s and again in the early 2000s. But the limestone exterior and the original vault door, now purely decorative, set into the lobby wall behind the teller stations, had not been touched. There were things in Merco that people simply did not change. Ray arrived at 9 on Monday morning. Owen beside him. He had called his son Daniel the night before and told him what they had found. And Daniel had listened without interrupting a quality Ray associated with Carol, who had also possessed it, and at the end had said, "Do you want me to come?" And Ray had said, "Not yet," and Daniel had accepted that. The branch manager was a woman named Susan Holt, early 50s, with the precise efficiency of someone who had been doing an exacting job for a long time and had achieved a kind of grace in it. Ray had known her professionally for years, not personally, but in the way of a small town where everyone knows everyone's name and approximate story. He showed her the key, he explained, briefly, what he had found and where. Susan Holt looked at the key, at Ray, and back at the key, with an expression that was professional in its composure, but carried underneath it the particular quality of someone who has just encountered something genuinely unusual. "Box 447, she said. "Let me check their records." She was gone for several minutes. When she came back, her expression had shifted slightly towards something that Ray could not immediately categorize. "Mr. Calloway," she said carefully, "that box has been active since 1975. It was opened under your father's name, Robert J. Calloway, with an annual fee paid in advance. The fee was last renewed in 2010. My father died in 2011, Ray said. "Yes." After 2010, the account went into a dormancy status under Texas state law. Unclaimed safe deposit boxers can eventually be turned over to the state controller, but that process takes a significant amount of time and involves multiple notification steps. Your father listed you as the secondary account holder. She paused. "So the box is accessible to you. It just... nobody came for it." Ray absorbed this. His father had listed him as the secondary holder, had known, on some level, that this was where the trail would end up. "I'd like to open it," Ray said. Box 447 was in the lower tier of the vault room, a cool, fluorescent-lit space that smelled of metal and controlled air. Susan Holt unlocked the outer mechanism with the bank's key, and Ray inserted key 447 into the second lock, and the box slid out with the smooth resistance of a mechanism that had not been used in 14 years. He carried it to the small private room adjacent to the vault, a narrow space with a table and 2 chairs and a single overhead light, and set it down. Owen stayed outside at Susan's quiet suggestion. Some things, she understood without being told, were meant to be opened alone. Ray sat down and opened the box. Inside were 2 envelopes and a folded paper document. The document was the deed exactly as his father had described in the letter. 12 acres, the river parcel, dated 1979. Filed with Taylor County, transferred from the Hendricks family to Robert G. Calloway. At the bottom of the document, in his father's handwriting, was a single line, not part of the official deed. For W.G., what should have been his... Ray set the deed aside and picked up the first envelope. It was addressed in his father's hand. To Walter Greer, C.O. Margaret Greer, Pattison, Portland, Oregon. It had never been mailed. The flap was sealed with the original glue, undisturbed. The second envelope was different. It was addressed to Ray, his name, and the farm's rural route address, and it was dated 2010, the year before his father died. This one, he opened. "Ray, if you're reading this, you already read the other one, so you know about Walter. I tried to find him 3 times. 1,985 1991 and 2001. In 1985, I found his sister Margaret's address. That's on the first envelope. I wrote the letter, but I never sent it. I don't know why. I think I was afraid he wouldn't write back. And the not writing back would be a kind of final answer I wasn't ready for. In 1991, I tried to track down Margaret's number through directory assistance, and the line was disconnected. In 2001, I hired a man in Abilene who does that kind of work finding people, and he told me that. Walter had been in Portland until the late 80s, then moved somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and then his trail went cold. He didn't know if Walter was alive or dead. I am 78 years old. My heart is not what it was. I know what the doctor is not quite saying when he talks to me. I am leaving this here because I could not do what needed doing, and I hope you can. The land should be offered to Walter's family if he has any. If he's gone, give it to someone who needs it. A young farmer, a family that's struggling. Don't let it sit idle. There is one more thing. When Danny Ortega helped you rebuild the motor in 2008, he found the first package. He called me from your barn when you went to the house for coffee. I told him to put it back and say nothing. He did, because he was that kind of man. I am sorry for asking him to carry that. Do what I could not do. Dad Ray sat in the small room for a long time. The overhead light hummed very softly. Somewhere in the bank, a phone rang twice and stopped. He could hear, very faintly, the sound of the air conditioning cycling on. He thought about his father and Danny Ortega standing on either end of a telephone call in 2008. One man in a hospital bed in Abilene. Eventually, no, that came later. One man in the kitchen of the farmhouse, while Ray walked back across the yard with 2 cups of coffee, unaware that a secret was being carefully replaced. He thought about Walter Greer, a young man grinning in a black and white photograph in front of a barn that no longer stood, his arm around his best friend. He thought about what it cost a person to carry something for 52 years. He folded the letter from 2010, put it in his shirt pocket, and took the deed and the unmailed envelope and walked back out to where Owen was waiting. Owen looked at his grandfather's face and said nothing, which was correct. "We need to find Walter Greer," Ray said. "Or his family." "Okay," Owen said. "Where do we start?" "Oregon," Ray said, "and we start today." They drove back to the farm and sat at the kitchen table with Ray's laptop, which Owen operated with the practiced ease of a person who had grown up navigating digital information. Ray sat beside him, the tin box and its contents spread on the table. The 2 letters and the deed and the photograph arrayed before them like evidence. "Walter Greer," Owen said, typing. "Born approximately when my father was born in 1932. Walter would have been close. Maybe 1930 to 1935? So he'd be between 89 and 94. Now, if he's alive, yes." Owen typed. He searched. He was methodical about it, in a way that reminded Ray of the way Owen approached a mechanical problem, not frantically, but with a systematic patience that was beyond his years. He tried different combinations. Walter Greer, Oregon. Walter Greer, Portland, Oregon. Walter Greer, Taylor County, Texas. Valtorelli. Greer, Walter R. Greer. After 20 minutes, he said, "I think I've got something." He turned the laptop so Ray could see. On the screen was an obituary from the Eugene, dated 2019. The headline read, "Wouter Leonard Greer, 86, farmer and conservationist." Ray read it. Walter Greer had been born in 1933 in Merkel, Texas. He had moved to Eugene, Oregon in 1972. There it was, the year, precise and confirming. He had purchased a small farm outside Eugene, had become involved in soil conservation advocacy, had served on the Oregon State Board of Agriculture for 12 years. He had been married once, to a woman named Patricia Halle Greer, who had predeceased him in 2014. He was survived by 2 children, a daughter, Renata Greer Morrison, of Eugene, and a son, Carl Greer, of Bend, Oregon. He had 5 grandchildren. He had died in April of 2019, 5 years ago. Ray took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He sat with that for a moment. The arithmetic of it. The fact that his father had spent 52 years trying to reach a man who had spent those same years 2,000 miles away, building a full and apparently meaningful life, a farm, a family, a legacy of conservation work, and that both men had gone to their graves without the conversation being completed. The weight of that was considerable. Owen, very gently, said, "He had kids." "Yes," Ray said. "Renata Graham Morrison, Carl Greer. They'd probably be in their 50s or 60s. Yes." Ray looked at the photograph on the table. Walter Greer at 20-something, grinning in front of the old barn. They didn't know about any of this. "Maybe not," Owen said. "Or maybe their father told them." Eventually, Ray considered that. Maybe Walter Greer, in his later years, had told his children about a friend in Texas, a falling out, a year he left and never went back. Maybe he hadn't. Either way, they were alive, and the river parcel was sitting on 12 acres of Taylor County waiting for someone to claim it. "I need to write a letter," Ray said. Owen nodded. "A real one. On paper. Do you want help?" Ray thought about his father, sealed in a small fluorescent room with an unmailed envelope for 34 years. "Yes," he said. "I think I do." It took Ray 4 days to write the letter. Not because the facts were complicated. The facts were actually straightforward, the kind of story that could be summarized in a few paragraphs, but because the framing of it required a kind of honesty that he found himself repeatedly approaching and then retreating from. He did not want to make it sentimental. He did not want to make it transactional. He wanted it to be true, and truth, he was discovering, had more textures than he had previously appreciated. Owen sat with him on the second evening, reading over a draft. "It's good," Owen said. "But Grandpa, in this paragraph, you're right, my father regretted the situation." That's not really what the letter said. Ray looked at the paragraph. What did the letter say? It said he carried it every day. That's different from regret. Regret is something you feel. What he described was more like he was always aware of it, like it was part of him. Ray studied his grandson, 16 years old. Carol's dark eyes. "You're right," he said. He crossed out the sentence and rewrote it. On the 4th day, the letter was finished. He read it aloud at the kitchen table, alone, which was something he had seen his father do with important documents and had always thought was strange, but which now made complete sense to him. The words needed to exist in the air before they were sent. The letter told Renata Greer Morrison and Carl Greer the following things: that their father and his father had been best friends, that his father had borrowed money, repaid it, but carried a lie that had broken the friendship, that Robert Calloway had spent decades trying to find a way to make it right, that he had failed to do so in his lifetime, that Ray had found in the engine of a 1987 tractor the evidence of that failure and the instructions for what to do with it, that the river parcel 12 acres in Taylor County, clear deed, no liens, had been purchased by Robert Calloway in 1979, with the explicit intention of offering it to Walter Greer or his family as a form of acknowledgement that could not be called repayment, but could be called something. He also enclosed the photograph. He did not enclose the unmailed letter his father had written to Walter. That, he had decided, was between his father and Walter, and both of them were gone now, and some things were allowed to remain private. He kept that letter in the tin box, and he put the tin box in the drawer of his mother's old writing desk in the front room, and he left it there. He mailed the letter on a Thursday afternoon, driving to the Merkel post office himself, rather than leaving it in the mailbox at the end of the drive, which was a thing he only did with mail that mattered. He received a response 11 days later. It came from Renata Greer Morrison, who turned out to be 61 years old and a landscape architect in Eugene. Her letter was handwritten, 2 pages on cream-colored paper, in a clear and readable hand. She wrote that she had sat with the letter for 2 days before she could respond. She wrote that her father had, in fact, spoken about Merkel occasionally, never in detail, always in the tone of something half-finished, and that as children she and Carl had understood there was a part of their father's past that he had not brought with him to Oregon, but they had not known what it was. She wrote that reading Ray's letter had been, in her words, like watching a door open in a house I grew up in that I didn't know was there. She wrote that the photograph had made her cry, and she was not someone who cried as. She wrote that she would speak with her brother Carl, and that they would like, if possible, to come to Texas. Ray read the letter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, with the light coming in through the east window the way it always came in at that hour, low and slanted, and the color of old honey, and he read it twice, and then set it down flat on the table with both hands resting on it. He called Daniel. "She's coming," he said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "To the farm, yes. She and her brother. They want to see it. How do you feel about that?" Ray looked out the window at the barn. The 4240 was still inside it, the valve cover still off, the engine still open. He had not continued to disassembly after that first morning. He had found himself unable to. "I feel like it's the right thing," he said. "I feel like it should have happened a long time ago, and I'm glad it's happening now." He paused. "And I feel like I owe your grandfather an apology." "For what?" "For not knowing what he was carrying." Ray was quiet for a moment. "We work alongside people for our whole lives, and we think we know them. And then you find a letter in an engine and you realize there was a whole other person in there." He shook his head. He was brave enough to write it down. "At least, even if he couldn't send it," Daniel said. Carefully, "Dad, he wrote it to you. He always intended for you to find it." "I know," Ray said. "That's what I'm sitting with." Renata Greer Morrison and Carl Greer arrived on the second Friday of November. They flew into Abilene and rented a car and drove out. Farm Road 707, the way everyone drove out to the Callaway farm, past the grain elevator, past the water tower with Merkel painted on it, in letters that had been repainted twice in Ray's lifetime, past the cotton fields in their post-harvest state, stripped and pale, the soil exposed and waiting. The sky was the enormous, uncomplicated blue of a West Texas. November, the kind of sky that people from other places found unsettling until they got used to it, and which Ray had spent his entire life underneath without ever quite taking for granted. They arrived at 11 in the morning. Ray was on the porch when they turned in the drive. Renata was tall and spare, with her father's easy posture and light hair, gone mostly white now, pulled back simply. Carl was shorter, broader, with a dark beard and the slightly weathered look of a man who also spent time outdoors. They got out of the rental car and looked at the farmhouse and the barn and the flat reach of the land, and Ray watched them take it in. He went down the porch steps to meet them. "Mr. Callaway," Renata said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were steady and light-colored gray-green, and they were full of something that Ray recognized as the effort of maintaining composure while moved. "Ray," he said. "Please, Ray." She held his hand for a moment. "Thank you for writing to us. Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." "We weren't sure either," Carl said honestly. He shook Ray's hand. "This is a strange thing to drive out to a stranger's farm for." "It is," Ray agreed. "Come inside. I have coffee on." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ray had read Renata's letter, where he and Owen had done their research, where his father had probably sat, writing the letter now, resting in the drawer of the writing desk in the front room, and drank coffee, and ate the peach preserves that Owen's mother Patricia had sent over, and talked. Renata talked about her father, the things she had known and the things she had not. Walter Greer had been, by his daughter's account, a quiet man with strong opinions about soil health and a sense of humor that came out sideways, unexpectedly, in situations where other people would have been grave. He had loved Oregon. He had made a genuine life there. But there had always been, she paused, looking for the word, an incompleteness about him when the subject of Texas came up. Not bitterness, not grief. Exactly. More like a problem he had decided not to solve, which was its own kind of grief. He used to say, Carl said, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug, that some things you can't fix by going back, So you fix them by going forward and doing better. We thought it was just something he believed in general. He paused. It turns out he was talking about something specific. Ray nodded. Did he ever mention my father by name? Ray asked. Renata and Carl exchanged a look. The quick, private communication of siblings. Once, Renata said, after our mother died. He was in the hospital for a week, a cardiac event, nothing fatal, but it frightened him. When he came home, he was quieter than usual for a while, and one evening I found him sitting in the garden and I asked if he was all right. And he said, she paused. Working to get it right, he said. I had a friend once who didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth, and I left instead of staying to work it out. And I was never sure afterward which of us made the worst decision. And then he changed the subject and never brought it up again. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Which of us made the worst decision? Ray repeated slowly. Yes. He knew, Ray said. He understood his own part in it. I think so, Renata said. I think by the end he did. Ray thought about two old men on opposite ends of a continent, sitting separately with the same unfinished sentence between them. He thought about how much easier it would have been if one of them, either of them, had picked up a telephone. He thought about himself and the things he carried, and the question of whether bravery got easier with practice or whether it was always exactly as hard as it felt. I want to show you something, he said. In the barn, he walked them out to the barn, the four of them, because Owen had arrived at 10 that morning, and Ray had introduced him simply as my grandson who found the key, and he showed them the 4 to 40. Renata walked slowly around the tractor, touching it lightly here and there, the way people touch things that are old and have meant something. She stopped at the engine compartment, still open from that first morning. He hid it in there, she said. Down behind the secondary bracket, Owen said, from his position near the workbench. He pointed. Renata leaned in and looked. Carl, beside her, did the same. He put it there the day after he bought the tractor. Ray said, 1987. He was 55 years old. He'd been carrying this for 15 years already. He paused, and then he put it in the engine, wrapped it up and put it in the engine, and every time I drove this machine, every acre I planted, it was in there. Renata straightened up. She looked at Ray. It sounds like something my father would have done, she said quietly. Put something important in a safe place and then not be able to retrieve it. She smiled slightly, and the smile was sad and affectionate at once. He used to write letters he didn't send. My mother found boxes of them after he died. To his bank, to his congressman, to old friends. Things he worked out by writing but never quite got to the sending part. Ray nodded. My father was the same way. He looked at the tractor. They were more alike than they knew. That might have been part of the problem. After the barn, they walked the property. Ray showed them the farm, the North 40, the cotton fields in their bare November state, the creek that marked the western boundary. He walked them to the river parcel, the 12 acres that sat along the creek, cottonwood trees along the bank, the grass long and pale in the November light. He stopped at the property line, an old post and wire fence that marked the boundary, and looked at the land. This is it, he said, the river parcel. 12 acres. Your father's name is not on the deed. It's in my father's name, and then Meany, but the intent is in writing. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded paper, the deed copy and a notarized document he had had drawn up with a lawyer in Abilene the previous week. This is the paperwork to initiate the transfer if you want it. I'm not. I want to be clear that I'm not asking for anything. I'm not trying to make this into something it isn't. My father wanted this land offered to Walter Greer or his family. Valtteri's gone. You're his family. He held out the document. The decision is yours. Renata looked at the land. The cottonwoods along the creek moved slightly in the November wind. The sky was the enormous Texas blue. She did not take the document immediately. She looked at the 12 acres for a long moment, at the creek, at the pale grass, at the fence line running in its straight West Texas geometry across the flat earth. Then she looked at her brother. Carl said nothing. He was looking at the land too, with an expression that Ray could not entirely read. something between wonder and a kind of grief that was not entirely sad. Dad never came back to Texas, Renata said. Not to anyone in particular. In 47 years, he never came back. No, Ray said, but he talked about it. She paused. Not often, but the way he talked about it, the flatness, the sky, the cotton, he missed it. I think he always missed it. She turned to look at Ray. He left because he was hurt and because he was proud, and then enough time passed that coming back felt too large. Yes, Ray said. I think that's right. And my father and your father were both proud men who missed each other for 50 years and never said so. Yes. Renata Gray Morrison looked at the document in Ray's hand for a long moment. Then she took it. She held it with both hands, looking down at it. Then she looked up at the land again, and at the cottonwoods, and at the sky. He would have loved this creek, she said. They stayed for 3 days. This had not been planned. Renata had booked a return flight for Saturday, Carl for Sunday. But Saturday came, and neither of them left, and when Ray said nothing about it, they said nothing about it either. And by Sunday morning there was coffee on, and the three of them were sitting at the kitchen table again, and Carl had driven into Merkel and come back with a bag of groceries and the quiet purposefulness of a man who has decided, without entirely deciding, to stay a little longer. Owen was there most of the time, which Ray had not expected but was glad of. Owen had a quality, that same quality Carol had had, of being present without imposing, of asking the right question at the right moment, and then being genuinely quiet with the answer. He and Carl spent an afternoon in the barn, working on the 4,240 together. Not with any particular plan, but with the organic logic of two people who both found the idea of a working engine intrinsically satisfying. Owen walked Carl through what he and Ray had done on that first morning. And Carl, who had spent enough time around his father's farm equipment to know his way around a diesel block, contributed his own knowledge. And by the end of the afternoon, they had made genuine progress. She could run again, Carl said, emerging from the barn with grease on his forearms and an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. Not field work. I don't think you'd want to put her back in the field, but she could run. She runs now, Ray said. I've kept her going. I mean properly. There are 3 things on the engine that need attention, but they're not complicated. Carl paused. If you want. Ray considered this. He looked at the barn. I'll think about it, he said. He was thinking about it already. On the last evening Monday, the day before they would actually leave, their flights rebooked by mutual unspoken agreement. The 4 of them sat on the porch after dinner. The sun went down over the flat Texas west, and the way it went down in November. Slow and deliberate, stretching the shadows of the bare cotton stalks across the pale earth, turning the sky from blue to a deep layered orange, and rose before the purple came in from the east. Ray had brought the tin box out. He set it on the porch railing and opened it and took out the photograph and handed it to Renata. She had seen it before. He had mailed her a photocopy with his original letter. But now she held the original, the black and white print on thick paper. Her father and his 2 young men in front of an old barn, grinning. She studied it for a long time without speaking. He looks so young, she said finally. They both do, Ray said. Carl leaned over to look. Something moved across his face, the particular emotion of seeing a parent young before you existed to know them. How old were they here? Owen asked. Maybe 22, 23, Ray said. This would have been around 1955 or 1956. Before the hard years. He paused. There were good years first. That's what I keep coming back to. There were years when this friendship worked, when it was real and solid, and they were happy in this picture. You can see it. Renata looked at him. It makes the rest of it sadder, or more hopeful, Ray said. Depending on how you look at it. He leaned back in his porch chair and looked at the darkening sky. It means it was real. Whatever broke it, the lie, the leaving, the years of silence. Before all that, it was real, and real things don't entirely disappear. The evening settled around them. A truck moved down Farm Road 707 in the distance, its headlights sweeping the flat land. Somewhere in the cotton rows, something small moved through the stalks with a purposeful rustling of a creature on its own business. The sky went from purple to a deep, final dark, and the stars came out, not timidly, the way they came out in cities, but all at once, in the Texas way, as though they had been waiting for permission. "My father would have sat on this porch," Renata said quietly. "If things had been different, he might have," Ray said. "There are a lot of porches he didn't sit on, a lot of conversations that didn't happen." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing you have to make peace with. You can do the right thing and it still doesn't fix what was broken. It means you're not adding more weight. Is that enough?" Owen asked. He was not asking rhetorically. He was genuinely asking the way he asked mechanical questions, expecting a real answer. Ray thought about it. "It has to be," he said, "because it's what's available." He looked at his grandson. "But there's something else. When you do the right thing, even late, even after the people most directly involved are gone, it changes something in you. It changes how you carry the story." He looked at Renata and Carl. "Before I found that letter, my father was a man who farmed and worked and died. A good man, but finished. A closed book. Now he's a man who struggled with something real and tried, in his way, to make it right, and left me the tools to finish it." He paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot." Renata looked down at the photograph in her hands. "Same with my father," she said softly. "Before your letter, there was just a door in the house that we knew not to open. Now there's a room we didn't know was there." She looked up, and the room isn't empty. It's got this in it." She gestured, meaning all of it. The farm, the porch, the 3 days, the starry sky. Carl, who had been quiet for much of the evening, said, "I want to bring my kids here someday." Everyone looked at him. He shrugged, slightly self-conscious, "To the river parcel. If that's okay, I want them to see it. I want to tell them what it is." He looked at Ray. "Is that okay?" "More than okay," Ray said. "That's exactly what it's for." They left on Tuesday morning, early. The sky was the pale pre-dawn gray that preceded the enormous Texas blue. Ray walked them to the rental car. Renata hugged him at the car door. She was not a person who hugged easily. He had gotten a sense of her over 3 days, and so the hug meant something. "My father would have liked you," she said. "Your father sounds like he was someone worth knowing," Ray said. "My father would have said so, if he'd ever gotten the words out." She laughed, a short, genuine laugh. Then she got in the car. Carl shook Ray's hand with both of his. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Owen stood at the edge of the porch and raised a hand, and Renata, through the car window, raised one back. Ray stood in the driveway and watched the rental car back out and turn onto Farm Road 707, heading toward Abilene and the flights home. He watched until the car disappeared into the flat distance, until there was nothing left but the road and the sky and the flat brown land. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he went to the barn. He stood inside the barn for a while, looking at the 4,240. The engine was still open, still waiting for the valve cover to go back on. Still in the state he and Owen had left it in on that first morning. The morning that had started as a simple exercise in evaluating an old machine and had become something else entirely. He thought about Derek Saunders, the man with the pressed shirt and the easy laugh. $300. Scrap value. He had thought about Derek Saunders occasionally over the years. Not obsessively, not with any particular bitterness, but the way you think about a moment that lodged itself into your memory for reasons that seemed small at the time and larger later. He wondered where Derek Saunders was now. He wondered if Derek Saunders had ever stood in a parking lot and laughed at the wrong thing. He wondered if it mattered. He decided it didn't much. Derek Saunders was a footnote, a man who had looked at an old machine and seen only its surface, and whose judgment had been the kind of judgment that revealed more about the judge than the thing being judged. Ray was no longer angry about it. He had not been angry about it for years. What he felt, standing now in the barn, was something more like gratitude, not toward Derek Saunders. Exactly, but toward the moment. The humiliation in the parking lot had been the thing that sent him home with the tractor instead of leaving it. The refusal to sell for $300 had been the thing that kept the $4,240 in the barn for 20 years, and keeping it in the barn was the thing that had led, eventually, to this. To Owen's hand, reaching into an engine block on a September morning, to a braskie stamped with a number 447, to 3 days on a porch with the children of his father's oldest friend. Not everything that looks like a wound is only a wound. He pulled up his shop stool and sat down beside the engine. He thought about Carl's assessment. 3 things that need attention, but they're not complicated. He thought about Owen's certainty. That first morning, you're not going to sell her for $600. He thought about his father, who had bought this machine new and had been proud of it and hidden something in its engine and driven it for 24 years and left it for his son. He found his sockets set. He found the valve cover. He thought about what Carl had said about the 3 issues in the block: a fuel injector seal, a coolant passage gasket, and the secondary bracket alignment. And he thought about how those were an afternoon's work for a man who knew what he was doing. And he thought about calling Owen. And he thought about whether the machine would run well with those things addressed. He thought it would. He thought it would run for years. He put on his reading glasses, positioned the shop light, and got to work. 3 weeks later, on a cold December morning, with frost on the cotton stubble and a sky the color of brushed steel, Ray Calloway started the 1987 John Deere 4240 and drove it out of the barn. Owen was there. He stood at the barn door with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched his grandfather ease the machine out into the gray morning light. And when the tractor cleared the door and came fully into the open, Owen grinned. Not the polite grin of a person performing an expected reaction, but the real one, the involuntary kind, the grin of someone who is genuinely glad. Ray drove it in a slow circle around the yard, feeling the weight of the machine, listening to the engine. It sounded the way it had always sounded. Deep and solid and the sound of something built to last and maintained with care. The frost on the ground crunched under the tires. The exhaust rose straight up in the cold air and dissipated into the gray December sky. He pulled up beside Owen and let the engine idle. "How is she?" Owen called up. "Perfect," Ray said. She meant it. Owen came up the ladder and stood on the step beside the cab, and Ray moved over to let him take the seat. And Owen sat down in it and put his hands on the steering wheel and felt the vibration of the engine through his palms and looked out over the hood at the flat December fields. "Grandpa," he said, "can I drive her?" "That's why I called you," Ray said. Owen put it in gear and drove it slowly down the farm road toward the North 40. The old machine moving through the December morning with a deliberate, unhurried dignity, and Ray stood in the yard and watched until they were a small shape in the distance, and then just the sound of the engine carrying back across the flatland. He stood there for a long time. He thought about his father. He thought, "I found it, Dad. I did what you couldn't do. And I'm not angry that you couldn't. You were a man, and men don't always get it right. And the things you got right were considerable," he thought. "You bought a good machine." The sound of the engine drifted back on the cold air, steady and even and absolutely sure of itself. The sound of something that had more miles left in it than anyone had given it credit for. Ray Calloway stood in the yard of the farm his grandfather had built and his father had kept and he had kept after that, and the December sky was enormous above him, and the cotton fields were bare and pale and waiting for the spring. And somewhere down the farm road his grandson was driving the machine in a slow, wide circle, learning the feel of it, getting it right. He took off his cap. He held it in both hands for a moment. Then he put it back on and went inside to make coffee and waited for Owen to come home.